This program was sponsored by the Jesse and John Dance Fund. Since 1962, these lectures have been a forum for distinguished scholars of national and international reputation who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe.
Good evening. My name is Marcia Landolt. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School here at the University of Washington, and on behalf of the Graduate School, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. We are here tonight as beneficiaries of a generous gift from the estate of Jesse and John Dance. This lectureship and visiting professorship program was created in 1961 by a bequest from Mr. John Dance. An additional gift was made to the university in 1969 by Mrs. Dance. This bequest is intended to bring to the University of Washington and to the citizens of this region distinguished lecturers, scholars, and authorities of international reputation, and I quote, who have concerned themselves with the impact of science and philosophy on man's perception of a rational universe. This was indeed a far-sighted and wonderful gift of the Dance family. And tonight's presentation by Professor Henry Louis Gates marks the 83rd event that has been sponsored on this lectureship program. Before we proceed with tonight's program, I would like to recognize a few individuals. We are very pleased that 6 members of the Dance family and some of their friends are with us tonight. We're very pleased to have you here with us. Choosing the dance lecturer is not an easy job. Each year we get many very worthy nominations, and the task of deciding who will be actually invited to come falls to the Walker Ames and Jesse and John Dance Selection Committee. I won't mention the names of all the members of the committee, but the co-chairs are here tonight. I'm pleased to introduce Michael Halloran from the Department of Classics and Gerald Baldesty from the School of Communications. And finally, putting on an event of this type takes a lot of logistics, and the person who handles that is Ms. Janet Jones, who works in the graduate school. Janet, I think, is still backstage twitching a bit, but she has worked really hard, as always, on this event, and I'm delighted that she is here tonight with her daughter, Jessica. Our speaker is going to be introduced by a distinguished member of the University of Washington faculty. Professor Robert Bob Crutchfield received his Bachelor of Arts degree at Thiel College in Pennsylvania, and he did his master's and doctoral degrees at Vanderbilt University. He joined the faculty of the University of Washington in 1979 as a professor of sociology. And in addition to his primary appointment in sociology, Dr. Crutchfield also holds an adjunct appointment in the American Ethnic Studies program. In addition, since 1991, he has been the director of the UW's Institute for Ethnic Studies in the United States. His field of expertise is crime and society. And in addition to his outstanding scholarship, Bob Crutchfield is one of this institution's most dedicated and most talented teachers. Bob.
Thank you, Dean Landolt. Very nice. It's a pleasure to welcome our guest, Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., to Seattle and to the University of Washington. In addition to the comments, the usual comments, that I would like to make as a part of my introduction of him. I'd like to take a few brief moments as well to comment on his topic tonight, race and class in America. Professor Gates is a W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Humanities, Professor of English, Chair of the Afro-American Studies Department, Director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for Afro-American Research at Harvard University. He has held academic appointments at Duke, Cornell, and Yale before moving on to Harvard. He holds a BA from Yale and graduate degrees from Cambridge. Among other fellowships, he has been a Woodrow Wilson National Fellow, a Mellon Fellow, and a MacArthur Prize Fellow. In addition to his widely read autobiography, Colored People, he is the author of Figures in Black, Words, Signs, and Racial Self, and the Racial Self, The Signifying Monkey, Towards a Theory of Afro-American Literary Criticism, Loose Cannons, Notes on the Culture Wars, and recently, Race and Reason, Black Letters in the Enlightenment. He has edited or co-edited more than 20 volumes and has published in numerous articles and essays in outlets ranging from contemporary literature to critical inquiry to the Village Voice to the New Yorker. Professor Gates is not a leading African-American scholar. He is simply a leading scholar. As I mentioned, Professor Gates will speak tonight on the topic of race and class in America. I sometimes, as provocatively as I can muster, proclaim in my course on the urban underclass that race and ethnic relations has been the most powerful force in American social history. Because you're here to hear Professor Gates tonight, I won't take your time to provide my supporting argument that I give to my students, but after making that argument to them, I send them off with direction to think about my comments, to think about my argument, and to return prepared to critique or counter that argument. The discussion upon their return inevitably leads them to a greater appreciation, a greater understanding of the complexity of both social history and race and ethnic relations. Among the important complexities that they begin to explore is the relationship between social class and race. In this time of renewed efforts by some to assert institutional mechanisms to maintain race-linked class reproduction in the forms of such attacks on affirmative action, threats to HBCUs, and welfare reform, it's important to remember what my students discover in that exercise, that the relationship between race and class is a very complex relationship. Professor Gates, along with his colleagues William Julius Wilson and Cornel West, have been articulate spokespersons for the value of moving beyond tired, simplistic ways of viewing black and white, rich and poor. We are fortunate to have Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. with us tonight to discuss race, class, and crime in America. Please welcome Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction and the warm welcome. It's great to be back in Seattle. I think I've lectured here about 3 or 4 times, and I always have a good time. I always leave. Every time I leave here, it takes me about 2 weeks to go to sleep. It's because all that good coffee that's on. It's on every block. And one of the reasons I love it here is that 2 of the people I admire the most in the whole world, Jacob Lawrence and Gwendolyn Knight, and as well as August Wilson. Of course, I guess that's 3 people, all live here. And I figured that there must be something very special about Seattle if they migrated here. And I knew this would be a special day because despite the fact that I've been here, I guess, 6 or 7 times, the first time I ever saw Mount Rainier, you know, I heard that it existed. I saw a picture of it, but I saw it out the window of the plane and almost fell out, so that was good. And I apologize for the fact that I had to reschedule my first appearance, but my wife was diagnosed with a tumor. And in fact, the diagnosis was that it was most probably cancer. And so she had surgery in early January, and thank God it was benign. But I was so preoccupied and really distressed, as you know, you all might imagine, that the little fact that I had to teach a course at Harvard a week earlier than I thought escaped my notice, and so the university was nice enough to reschedule, and I'm deeply appreciative. Tonight, I'm going to talk about race and class, as Bob said, and I'm going to talk about multiculturalism, or what I think of as race in class. But first, I want to share with you how I fell in love with books in general, and with learning in general, and fell in love with books about being black, even more specifically, back in the town of Piedmont, West Virginia. There was one school in Piedmont, West Virginia, the Appalachian Village where I grew up, and little Brenda Kimmel was its princess, or at least its princess as far as I was concerned. Now, Brown v. Board, the famous Supreme Court decision, having been decided in 1954 when I was 4 years old, I found myself 2 years later busy scampering hard alongside Brenda Kimmel at our newly integrated elementary school, for I was to be this school's little brown prince. Now, Brenda Kimmel, I have to confess, was the obsession of my grade school and my high school years. This girl ate books. She went through books faster than anyone I knew except for my father. Brenda would sit in study hall in total concentration, twirling her hair and devouring page after page after page. So at the age of 13 or thereabouts, hormones raging and practical man that I am, I started to read books too. I tried to turn the pages about the time that she would turn hers, you know. So. Now, I'd been reading books before then, mind you, lots of books, but pretty much only books about sports. I read sports books in order to get closer to my father and to my brother, whose mutual passion for sports had created a bond that pretty much excluded me. So if I couldn't fully share in their passion for sports, at least I would know something about what they were talking about if I read sports books. So I did all of my book reports in school on sports books, books with such deep scholarly titles like Basketball Bones and Last Second Shot. Books, in other words, that I could read in about 45 minutes. Of course, it wasn't just Brenda's example that had made me change. It was also Mrs. Iverson, my 8th grade English teacher, who had finally rebelled. Those books you are reporting on, she had said to me one day, completely out of the blue, from the front of the classroom, are fluff. You are forbidden from reporting on them ever again. Fluff, I didn't even know what fluff was, but I knew I was deeply offended. And what was I supposed to read instead? She handed me a copy of a book, and I looked at it. It was called A Tale of Two Cities. I looked at it and I said, I can never read a book that thick. How about another book? How about a longer sports book? Just read the book, she said. You know, I stayed up most of the night reading that book, and I was sorry when I fell asleep and I couldn't read any longer. I went on to read Les Miserables, and then I read a biography about Albert Einstein and another one about Albert Schweitzer. It was called Genius in the Jungle. It had green hardback covers, and it was written by someone called Joseph Gollum. Albert Schweitzer was a revelation to me. I wanted to learn to play organs and restore them, just like Albert Schweitzer did. I wanted to be walking past the church on the day of Pentecost on my 30th birthday, hear the voice of God, decide to change my life, secure with the knowledge that I would help all the world, and win the Nobel Prize for Medicine. I read a book called My Sweet Charlie, a civil rights tearjerker. You have to remember, this is 1964. It was a tearjerker about a black boy and a white girl who fall in love. The boy gets lynched, I think, or anyway, something very terrible happens to him because of white racism, and it all comes to quite a melodramatic ending. I bought a copy and gave it to Brenda Kimmel. Somehow, I don't think she appreciated the plot. You can't blame a guy for trying, though. And then I read The Agony and the Ecstasy, completely enraptured by Irving Stone's divine kitsch. It was I who was carving the Carrara marble, molding it with my chisel like clay. But best of all, I have to confess, was that passage about Michelangelo making love with his mistress early one afternoon, especially the part about how he had come to her house unannounced, how she had answered the door wearing her robe only, how she had opened it for him when he had kissed her, and how red her nipples had appeared against her tan body. You know, I read that page so often. It turned a completely different color than every other page in that book. It was the first time I'd ever been aroused by words on a page, still a strange and mystical experience. Only with the greatest reluctance did I return that book to our school library. On Saturdays, I used to hitchhike. My parents didn't have a car, so I would hitchhike 5 miles away to the county seat of Kaiser, to the county library, and I'd check out recordings of Shakespeare's plays, and I'd listen to the recordings while I read the books. I loved the sound of Richard Burton's voice and the clamping of the horses in Macbeth. And none of this, unfortunately, ever impressed Brenda Kimmel. But where Brenda and I parted company, really, and where I parted company with everyone else in my school, was when it came to books about being black, because here I dwelt in a kingdom all my own. I'd read about the books in Ebony magazine, and then I'd go down to the middle of our town to something called Red Bull's newsstand, and I'd order the books through a distributor because this was an immigrant town, an Irish-Italian paper mill town, and so there were no black books in the mid-1960s stocked in any store. And the books would come in, and I would rush down to read them. They were mostly those old Dell paperbacks. And I paid for them with money that I got from collecting the deposits on bottles, which meant that I spent quite a lot of time collecting and selling bottles. The list of authors printed at the back of those Dell paperbacks became my first canonical reading list. I remember the color of the pages, the size of the print, their red and black covers. I'd order other books by people I'd heard of only vaguely, and I'd read those books too. Getting a new book in at Red Bull's newsstand was almost as exciting as smelling a new textbook on the first day of school or sniffing those old mimeographed handouts that we used to get from ditto machines. You know, I read an article in Scientific American that said the reason that we loved smelling sniffing those pages was that ink was making us high. So I ordered one for my study, but more ditto, please. Hasn't come in yet. But now in the 8th grade, I became obsessed with black books, and I would read these at one sitting. I remember one of my heroes, the great James Baldwin, saying something about having the opportunity to feel like a human being for the first time in his life while living in Europe and wondering what in the world he could possibly be talking about. Baldwin also said something about coming to terms with the fact of his blackness high in the Alps in Switzerland while listening to someone called Bessie Smith. I hadn't even heard of Bessie Smith. I wouldn't hear Bessie Smith's music until my sophomore year at Yale, that well-known center of African American culture. But that was okay because James Baldwin played Bessie Smith for me. And later that year, I remember doing a book report for Mrs. Iverson on Dick Gregory's new autobiography with the curious title, Nigger, and the battle of wills that we had about her saying the title out loud in our class. She refused. I had said it first, but her awkwardness about it made the word sound dirty, even in my mouth, and we said the word nigger at home all the time. But most of all, I remember the funny shade of crimson that Mrs. Iverson's face blushed when the nurtured crescendo of my oral presentation somehow culminated on the word nigger. And I sat down to silence, part of me satisfied, part of me frightened, but all the time knowing that I had passed through some kind of gate. Unlike the bottles I sold back to Red Bulls, I was non-returnable. So that's how I first encountered the humanities, a substitution of the love of books for the love of the flesh. Fortunately, when I outgrew adolescence, I discovered to my enormous satisfaction that one could have both. You know, speaking of adolescence, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that America had passed from adolescence to senility without ever having experienced adulthood. Now, that may be broadly true of Americans generally, but it's not such a bad thing if you think about it. The adolescent is trying to find himself or herself according to the cliche, and once you find yourself, why, what do? Why, you get yourself laminated, laced with sodium benzoate, and preserve whoever it was you decided you were when you were in college over the next few decades of your life. That, by custom, is what we call adulthood in this country. And also by custom, a university education is the ideal rite of passage to this venerable end. But in fact, if we're honest, college has always served as a crucible where difference and commonality clash and collide and overcome. It goes against common sense for some people to be told that you have to learn and relearn your ethnic identity, how to be black or how to be white, how to be Jewish or how to be gay. At Yale in 1969, I became secretary of something called the Black Student Alliance at Yale, the BSAY. But most of all, I remember in my first year there attending the very first meeting of this group. And I remember the great trepidation that I experienced as a transplant from the back hills of Appalachia in the company of these largely urban new Negroes. People black and smart and elegant and from elsewhere with a capital E. See, if you're from a small town, there are only two places in the universe. That's the Valley and elsewhere. And these brothers definitely were not from the hollows of West Virginia. Now, this was a group with a definite sense of what was and what was not authentically black, as we used to put it in the 60s, jockeying for a position by being blacker than thou. Well, filing out after 2 hours of this, of just fear and trembling on my part, I turned to a friend, a new friend, a guy named Linwood. He was from North Carolina, is now a very prominent cardiac surgeon. And I turned to Linwood and I'd ask him whether he too had found it hard to fit in, whether he too had felt that trepidation. And I'll always remember what he said to me. Skippy said, shaking his head sadly at all the posturing that we had seen, I don't know about you, but I've been black my whole life. It was as if a load had been lifted from my shoulders. Now, I should explain that the village in which I grew up the Potomac River, 2 hours west of D.C., was essentially a segregated village. It was my generation that saw the sweeping changes associated with the great civil rights era. And our parents watched us with the fascination and unease with which I imagine Captain Kirk might regard Captain Picard. A sort of generational shift was enacted. There were expectations, but not, I think, crushing expectations. Our parents at the cusp of an era did not require that we do everything right. Their only hope was that we do a little bit better than they did. We used to call that progress in this country. In Piedmont, West Virginia in the 50s, I had learned how to be a Negro. At Yale in the late 60s and early 70s, I was bound and determined that I would learn how to be a proud black man. Of course, it was always possible to carry a good thing too far. In my senior year, I wrote a column for the student newspaper, the Yale Daily News, about all things black. Now, actually, I was supposed to write about anything that struck my fancy, but you better believe that it was black by the time I got through with it, no matter what the topic was. When a couple of my black friends, including my girlfriend, Linda Darling, if you can believe that for a name, gave a piano recital performing Bach and Beethoven, I waxed eloquent in my column about Beethoven's supposed African roots and maybe even the superiority of the ebony keys over the ivory keys. I also had about a 2-foot-high afro. My daughters look at it and say, "You look like a Klingon, Daddy. You look like a Klingon." Or Afro Man, they call me. Somehow my girlfriend did not appreciate my review of her, of her concert. Now, it's easy enough to poke fun at identity politics in this country, but it often seems that all politics is on some level identity politics. Tribalism never prospers, the great social theorist Ernest Gellner has wryly observed, for when it does, everyone will respect it as a true nationalism, and no one will dare call it tribalism. I think that those who complain that our students today take too much interest in their collective identities should be listened to, because yes, dangers do lie that way. But I also think it's worth emphasizing, too, that what the Village Voice critic Greg Tate calls white boyism is a collective identity, too. Too often we speak in this country as if race is something only black people have. Sexual orientation is something that gays and lesbians have. Gender is something women have. Ethnicity is something so-called ethnics have. And so if you don't fall into any of those categories, well, then you don't have to worry about any of those things. I'll never forget when several years ago, a very distinguished professor of English from the University of Chicago arrived at Cornell, where I was a professor, to deliver a lecture entitled The Ethics of Reading. But due to a typographical error, however, the local flyers had billed the talk as The Ethnics of Reading. While the professor arrived in this huge lecture hall in a rather bad temper, he inspected his audience, and he told them that his lecture had, to his great dismay, been misadvertised. His subject was ethics, not ethnics, he stressed, and if anyone had come expecting to hear him say anything ethnic, they would be sorely disappointed, and he invited them to leave the auditorium at once. And with that curious preface, he proceeded to give a lecture on Irish literature. That was inevitably as ethnic as anything that we would do in the Department of Afro-American Studies. It simply wasn't ethnic to him. Ethnicity, we can't live with it, we can't live without it in this country. It is the mission of history, Ortega y Gasset tells us, to make our fellow beings acceptable to us. But how do we go about doing this? I think that we can understand one strain of multiculturalism as a form of mutual accommodation, a stance of intellectual and cultural tolerance. Not complete tolerance, which, if you think about it, is a moral impossibility, but provisional tolerance, the willingness to err on the side of tolerance. Now, I just said complete tolerance is impossible. Indeed, I say now it is undesirable. We do draw the line. We must draw the line. If we pride ourselves on being self-critical, in recognizing our own failings, it cannot be possible to regard values and norms as sacrosanct simply because they belong to another culture or to another way of life. Patriarchy doesn't become prettier because it's practiced by Papuans. Kleptocracy isn't more forgivable when practiced by Mobutu in Zaire instead of Michael Milken on Wall Street. Besides, not every identity, so-called, is compatible with basic values of humanity, civic equality, and respect that we might wish to promote as a society. I often think of Randall Jarrell's mordant observation: if you have been put in your place long enough, you begin to act like the place. But you can't just void collective identity like a canceled stamp. Just consider the resurgence of nationalism in the wake of the Soviet Empire. 90 years ago, another of my heroes, the great African-American philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote famously that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line, with ethnic violence raging in no less than 48 countries since 1992, from Bosnia to Burundi, from Turkestan to Tibet. You don't need a crystal ball to be able to predict that the problem of the 21st century will be the problem of ethnic identity, as ethnicity comes to stand as a mask or a metaphor for deeper structural economic differentials and economic scarcity. Who among us this evening would have thought 20 years ago that when we spoke in 1997 of ethnic violence in Georgia, we would be speaking of a republic in the ex-Soviet Union and not some town down the road from Atlanta? Or think of Thomas Macaulay, presiding over Indian pedagogy in 1836. Macaulay predicted that, and I quote, "No Hindu who has received an English education ever remains sincerely attached to his religion. It is my firm belief," Macaulay continued, "that if our plans of education are followed up, there will not be a single idolater among the respectable classes in Bengal 30 years hence," unquote. Nice try, Master Macaulay. Another problem with talking about identity politics is that there is no identity without politics. Identity will always be a site of contestation, and that means that identities are always fluid, always evolving in relation to other identities. Neither the forces that favor acculturation nor those opposed should be dismissed ahead of time, because surely both will always be in play. And it's especially important to think these issues through here in America, because it is a distinctive trait of America that we have always conceived of ourselves as a plural nation. Even the mixed feelings that are frequently aroused by issues around immigration and naturalization attest to this. A few decades ago, Dwight MacDonald suggested the following revised inscription for the Statue of Liberty, and I quote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, provided they have satisfactorily filled out Forms 3584A through 2597Q, especially, we might add, if they're sailing from Haiti." Bureaucracy, he knew, was how we filtered our reality from our ideals. Today, corporations like to speak of managing diversity. And in a sense, multiculturalism, as my friend Cornel West has complained, belongs to the language of bureaucrats. Very often, the way it's used, it really doesn't have anything to do with culture. Stuart Hall, the great black British cultural critic, used to say that postmodernism amounts to everybody everywhere wanting to be an American. So we know the real cultural commonalities that we're not supposed to talk about. We're not supposed to acknowledge the existence of popular culture, and it's painful for so many professors to admit that the icons of MTV carry vastly greater cultural resonances for most of our students than the most revered masters of the literary canon. I guess in some ways it's hard to pinpoint what's new about the new multiculturalism. Often it seems that what's most exceptional about America is its abiding belief in its own exceptionalism. What do proponents of multiculturalism today have to say that wasn't said rather more elegantly by Randolph Bourne, say, or Horace Kalin 75 years ago? There are differences, of course, but they are in the details. And perhaps that is enough. We cannot require of contemporary pluralism that it get everything right, only that it does a little bit better than its precursors. Again, that dream of progress. In all events, when people mourn the demise of the melting pot model, it's important to remind them that it never was an uncontested ideal. Even in that Israel Zangwill play that popularized the term, the hero muses that, and I quote, "Those who love us must suffer, and we must suffer in their suffering. It is live things, not dead metals, that are being melted in the crucible." Now, that's not to deny that an emphasis on commonality as well as difference is important. I believe in civic humanism, but then so do most cultural pluralists that I know. Pluralism isn't supposed to be about policing the boundaries. It's supposed to be about breaking those boundaries down, acknowledging the fluid and interactive nature of all of our identities. And I guess that's why I'm uncomfortable with the notion of adulthood being founded on a static, laminated sense of self. The notion that finding yourself, that self-fashioning and refashioning are another of those adolescent maladies like acne that somehow we're all supposed to outgrow. What if instead we saw this kind of refashioning as one of the truly ethical tasks of our entire lives? So I don't say to our students, express yourself as Madonna would have it. I say invent yourself. And don't restrict yourself to off-the-rack models either, because there isn't one way to be white or black, gay or straight, Hispanic or Asian, liberal or conservative, male or female, and a stronger sense that you nurture of the contingent nature of all such identities, the less likely it is that you will be harmed by them or in their name inflict harm upon others. As James Baldwin put it so beautifully, each of us, helplessly and forever, contains the other. Male in female, female in male, white in black, black in white. We are a part of each other, Baldwin continued. Many of my countrymen appear to find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair, and so very often do I, he concluded. But none of us can do anything at all about it. We needed to hear those words 2 decades ago. We need to hear them in America today. We have all heard in recent years about the politics of identity, a politics that has a collective identity as its core. One is to assert oneself in the political arena as a woman, as a homosexual, as a Jew, as a person of color. But while the conversation about it may seem recent, the phenomenon itself is ages old. The politics of identity starts with the assertion of a pre-given identity. It says, this is who I am, who we are. Make room for me, make room for us. Accommodate my special needs, our special needs. Confer recognition upon what is distinctive about me, what is distinctive about us. It is about the priority of difference. By contrast, what I'm calling liberal humanism starts not with identity, but with the ability to identify with. Less important than the identity of the other is the capacity to identify with the other. It asks what we have in common with others while acknowledging the internal diversity among ourselves. It is about the priority of a shared humanity. In short, I believe that we must move in this country from a politics of identity to a politics of identification. And the beginning of such a move must be made in our public schools through a rigorous multicultural curriculum. A rigorous multiculturalism does not entail when in Rome relativism. It forbids it. For relativism is finally a way of not taking other cultures seriously. A rigorous multiculturalism does not entail the elevation of difference over commonality. It rejects it. For such multiculturalism seeks to broaden the constricted vistas of ethnic absolutism. And finally, a rigorous multiculturalism does not entail the proliferation of vulgar identity politics. For an honest account of ethnic dynamism gives full weight to the forces of assimilation and convergence, as well as those of differentiation and divergence. And once we manage to sort these things out, we might be able to retrieve a viable vision of multiculturalism as an antidote to the ever-alluring perils of ethnocentrism and cultural chauvinism. After all, if you think about it, we haven't just entrusted to our schools the task of reproducing the democratic polity, we've asked that they improve it too. I want our schools to teach, as increasingly they do, the story of America as a plural nation, with people from different lands who had different and shared experiences, and not simply as a tale of pilgrim triumphalism. But I also want our elementary schools to inculcate civic virtues. I want them to discourage youngsters from smoking, from accepting candy from strangers, and from hating brown-skinned people. Now that's not to call for distortion in the name of celebration, because the truth will serve us very well. Kathy Davidson, recently the president of the American Studies Association, wrote, and I quote, "Multicultural representation, gender equity, diversity, forget it. Just give me good history, whether social or literary history, a far more dangerous proposition." As Davidson notes, this was a continent inhabited by various American cultures long before the Puritans made their way to these shores. Slaves and immigrants built much of the country, a country that extends far beyond New England. Roughly half of the population has always been female. Not all of it was ever heterosexual, and relatively little of it, any gender, racial, or immigrant group, has been rich. With this kind of history, in short, who needs special pleading? It may well be that such special pleading is not the province of multiculturalism, but the denial of multiculturalism, and that's because we have been multicultural in America all along. We cannot even imagine a truly American culture that is not multiple in its roots and multiple in its branches. There are no shortcuts to ethnic harmony, to be sure, and those who look to a multicultural curriculum as a cheap fix for expensive structural problems are bound to be disappointed. Enlightened multiculturalism isn't some magic wand that would alleviate the ethnic strife throughout the world. Hostile ethnic identities are as often the outcome of such strife as their cause. Even so, it seems to me, our task is clear. We must learn to live without the age-old deleterious dream of purity, whether purity of bloodlines or purity of cultural inheritance, and learn to find comfort, solace, and even fulfillment in the rough magic of the cultural mix, however imperfect and however mutable that cultural mix might be. I don't stand before you this evening to claim that the multicultural truth shall set us free, but like democracy, it seems to enjoy a decided edge over all the other alternatives. But democracy in this country is experiencing a crisis, and it is a crisis of class differentials. For my community, the great African American community, it is the best of times, it is the worst of times. We have the largest black middle class in our history. Black middle class quadrupled since the terrible day that Dr. King was so brutally assassinated in 1968. And yet, we have the largest black underclass. 45% of all black children live at or beneath the poverty line. In 1990, 2,280,000 black men were somehow in the care of the prison system, while 23,000 earned a college degree. That's a ratio of 99 to 1. The ratio for white males in 1990 was 6-1. What do we do about this as a society? What do we not do? What do we African Americans do about it? Well, first of all, among African Americans, we have to stop feeling guilty about our own success. Too many of us have what psychologists call the guilt of the survivor. The deepest anxiety is about leaving the rest of our fellow blacks behind in an inner city of despair. We need to feel the commitment to service to the people left behind, not to guilt. Our community, our families prepared us to be successful. Get all the education you can, boy, they told us over and over and over again when we were growing up. And that's what we did. When I left home for Yale in 1969, virtually my whole hometown, or at least the colored section of my whole hometown, as we put it back then, came out to wave goodbye to celebrate that fact. Of course, in many ways you could interpret that, but finally got rid of that little Negro. The community, as we still so romantically put it, wanted us to succeed. Talking black, walking black, wearing kente cloth with your tuxedos, listening to black music, filling our walls with black art. As desirable as these things can be in and of themselves, none of them is essential to being black, quote unquote, if your individual sensibility is not attuned to any of those things. I give a lecture with the president of Harvard to the entering black fresh persons and their parents, and I say to them that you can love Mozart, Picasso, and even ice hockey. I used to say golf, but Tiger Woods has taken over golf, so I had to find a new metaphor. You could love Mozart, Picasso, and ice hockey and still be as black culturally as the ace of spades. Second, we don't have to fail in order to be black. Now, as odd and as crazy as this might sound, just look at the next Gallup poll survey of inner city black kids. Far too many of our people say succeeding is white, speaking standard English is white, getting straight A's in school is white. I even saw a survey in the Washington Post that said visiting the Smithsonian was white. Now, had any of us said this kind of thing when we were growing up in the 50s, first thing, your mother would have beat your butt. And then your family and friends would have checked you into a mental institution. We need more success individually and collectively as a people, not less success. And third, we cannot pretend any longer that 35 million people are going to be members of exactly the same economic class. Think about this. What a bizarre idea. We are a nation within a nation. The entire population of Canada is 27 million people, and we have 35 million black people. Canadians are not all members of one economic class. They don't speak with one single voice, united behind a single leader. They don't even speak one language. You know, as each of us knows, we have never been members of one socio-economic class, and we never will be. The best that we can strive for is that class differentials within the black community, what I think of as the bell curve of class, cease their lopsided ratios because of the pernicious nature of white racism. Even if racism would disappear magically overnight, which, believe me, it is not about to do, we will still face class differentials within the black community. We have had these since slavery. Our job is to demand the end of sexism and racism so that some kind of more normal differentiation can occur without systematic structural racial discrimination. So how do we do this? How do we fight the power, as Spike puts it, in a post-civil rights era in which Bull Connors and George Wallace are no longer the easy targets that white racists used to be? A world in which the rhetoric of civil rights often sounds hollow and empty. I certainly have no magic cures, because race differentials and class differentials have been ground together in a crucible of misery and squalor in such a way that few of us can tell where one stops and the other begins. But I do know that the causes of poverty are both structural and behavioral. As scholars as diverse as my colleagues Cornel West and William Julius Wilson in their various ways have pointed out, and we would be foolish to deny this. A household comprised of a 16-year-old mother, a 32-year-old grandmother, and a 48-year-old great-grandmother cannot possibly be a site for hope and optimism. Our task, it seems to me, is to lobby for those social programs that have been demonstrated to make a difference for those sufficiently motivated to seize these expanded opportunities. More importantly, however, we have to demand a structural change in this country, the equivalent of a Marshall Plan for our cities. We have to take our people off of welfare, train them for occupations relevant to a 21st century, highly technological, global economy, and put them to work and not flipping burgers down at McDonald's. Because joblessness, as Bill Wilson maintains in his new book, is our biggest and most crushing crisis. And while I favor such incentives as tax breaks to generate new investment in our inner cities, youth apprenticeships with corporations, expanded tax credits for earned income, and tenant ownership of inner city property, I believe that we will have to face the reality that most of our inner cities are not simply going to become overnight oases of economic prosperity and corporate investment, and we should most probably begin to think about moving black inner city workers to the jobs rather than hold our breath waiting for new factories to resettle in the inner city. It is only by confronting the twin realities of white racism on the one hand and our own failures within the black community to take the initiative and break the cycle of poverty on the other hand, that we, the remnants of what Du Bois called the talented 10th, which he defined as the college-bred Negro, will be able to assume a renewed leadership role for and within the African American community. To continue to repeat the same old stale formulas, to blame the man for oppressing us all in exactly the same ways, to scapegoat Koreans, Jews, or even Haitians, as my fellow black Bostonians do, for our own failure, the failure of black Americans to seize local entrepreneurial opportunities, is to fail to accept our role as leaders of our own community. Not to demand that each member of the black community accept individual responsibility for her or his own behavior, whether that behavior assumes the form of black-on-black homicide, gang members violating the sanctity of our churches, unprotected sexual activity, gangster rap lyrics, misogyny, anti-Semitism, homophobia, whatever, is for us to function merely as ethnic cheerleaders selling wolf tickets from the campus or the suburbs rather than saying the difficult things that may be unpopular with our fellows. Being a leader does not necessarily mean being loved. Loving one's community means daring to risk estrangement and alienation from that community in the short run, if that's what it takes, in order to break a cycle of poverty, despair, and hopelessness that our people have been in over the long run. For what is at stake is nothing less than the survival of our country and the survival of the African American people themselves. And just as we must continue to fight for more and more people of color to be admitted to the student bodies and hired on the faculty and staff of our colleges and universities through affirmative action, we must fight to see that the Congress and the President enact a comprehensive job bill, that equivalent of the Marshall Plan for the cities, and finally to help bridge the painful gap between those of us on campus and those of us left behind on the streets. I call upon the historically black colleges and universities and the major departments of African American studies in this country to institutionalize sophomore and junior year summer internships for community development through organizations such as the Urban League and the NAACP and Marian Wright Edelman's Great Children's Defense Fund, so that we can begin to combat teenage pregnancy, black-on-black crime, the spread of AIDS from drug abuse and unprotected sexual relations, AIDS the leading cause of death for black males between the ages of 25 and 44, and begin to counter the spread of despair and hopelessness that so affects the African American community. Working together in programs such as these, we can perhaps begin to bridge the gap that has divided the black community into two. Dr. King did not die so that half of us would make it, half of us perish, forever tarnishing 2 noble centuries of agitation for our civil rights. We, the members of Du Bois's talented 10th, must accept our historical responsibility and live Dr. King's credo that none of us is free until each of us is free, and that all of us are brothers and sisters, as Dr. King said so long ago, white and black, Protestant and Catholic, Gentile and Jew and Muslim, gay and straight, rich and poor, even if we are not brothers or sisters in law. Thank you very much. Thank Yes, sir. If anybody up there, yell, because I can't see you. Yes, sir.
There was a very interesting headline in the New York Times today. Donald Trump plays principal in a public school for a day.
Huh.
And he sort of fumbled about how he would react to fifth grade kids in talking to them. So he offered them an opportunity to win a pair of sneakers and go to Nike Town at Trump Tower. Mm-hmm. The bottom line of the story was a little 11-year-old got up and said to him, "How come you offer them sneakers instead of scholarships?"
Oh, that's good. Send me that guy's name. He'll go to Harvard, that kid.
My question is, there always is that romance and glamour to doing things at the college level.
Yes.
People get their names associated with gifts, grants, and what have you. What does it take to begin where the beginning really starts, right at the beginning of education, to involve more of corporate America, to involve more of the private sector, to involve more individuals and say, we care?
Well, I think that's a great question. I don't know what it takes. Well, obviously we have to find what it takes is to glamorize economic commitment, philanthropy from the bottom up. But that's going to take a broad movement, probably from the White House on down. And I don't see that happening right now. I think that elementary school teachers should be paid what a professor at the university level makes. All those people are elementary teachers who just But, and I think that the sneakers thing, I mean, I'm just sort of haunted by that. I did a piece for Sports Illustrated in 1991, and I just had this idea, a suspicion. So I asked their research department to go through the census, you know, check the whatever it's called, you know, the summary of the census. And just facts to me the total number of the total number of black doctors, black lawyers, black dentists, and black professional athletes. The number of people who make their living full-time, major league, minor league, from professional athletics. You know the results? I went to the colored VFW, as we call it in Piedmont, West Virginia, where everybody gets off the paper mill about 3:30, and they get these water glasses full of scotch and gin for 75 cents. So by 4:30, everybody's loaded, right? So I waited till about 5 o'clock, put $50 on the bar, and I said, I'll give anybody here $50 to tell me how many black athletes there are. And I said, to trick them, I said, there are 35 million black Americans. So one guy said, 10 million black athletes. But he was drunk, right? You know. So finally, you know, people said 500,000, 100,000. You know what the statistics are? And according to the 1990 census, these aren't exact, so don't hold me to these, but they're approximate. 20,000 black lawyers, 15,000 black doctors, 5,600 black dentists, I remember that because of my brother, and 1,200 black athletes. 1,200. It's easier to be a brain surgeon than to be a professional athlete. But our people don't know that. I mean, we've been victimized by this Nike mentality. I mean, nothing against Nike, but it's just we've been victimized by that, and we have internalized it. When I was growing up, the blackest thing you could be was Dr. King or Thurgood Marshall or Mary McLeod Bethune or somebody. It was not to be, even as much as we like Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and Elgin Baylor, it wasn't that same kind of mystic experience, you know, to be one of these guys. And we have really gone wrong. That's why I say our people, too. You know, we need a moral, ethical revolution within the African-American community. And everybody in here is black knows that I'm telling the truth. We do. And the question is, it's one of the things I like about reform movements. You know, what I don't like is when the right tries to co-opt that need or necessity to say, okay, pick yourself up by your bootstraps because everybody else in America did it. You know, you got to have boots and you have to have straps. You know, you need structural intervention as well, but we need both things working in tandem. We need both things simultaneously. You can't do one without the other. There is a culture that perpetuates, you know, not that black culture is pathological. Obviously, I don't believe that. I love black culture. I make my living writing about black culture. I relish in black culture. But that perpetuation of the poverty cycle, that is real. I don't care what you want to call it. It is real. People learn how to be poor just like they learn how to be successful. And we have to break that cycle. And if we don't, you know what's going to happen? It's not going to be the coming race war. It's going to be the coming class war. Those of us in the black middle class are going to perpetuate ourselves, no matter how tenuous we feel our hold on the middle class is. I mean, we all knew arriving to the middle class feel that they're 1 or 2 paychecks from falling back into another class. But gradually, we will continue to perpetuate ourselves. Our kids will go to great universities like this. And the people stuck in the ghetto, by and large, will continue to be stuck in the ghetto. And that is an alternative that I frankly find unacceptable. I don't think that the black middle class is big enough. And I think that what we have to do is figure out a way to change that. And none of the old formulas are working. You know, that the rhetoric is tired. One of the reasons that I'm so delighted to be the head of the Du Bois Institute is that it's a black think tank. And what I want to do, I mean, I'm a literary critic. I have a PhD in English. You know, I'm not a social theorist. But I can administer and raise money from a little bit. And what I want to do is to endow the Du Bois Institute so that people like Cornel West and William Julius Wilson and other people who are yet to come, Lonnie Guinier, we're trying to get her, and I hope that she comes. But people like that can sit, and lots of other people for generations and generations, can sit and figure out how do race and class come together, and what can we do to transform the dire poverty statistics that we all know so well. That is the challenge, I think, of our generation.